It was born the Devastator, yet it became the Devastated. Such was the tragic fate of the Douglas TBD Devastator. The TBD was the U.S. Navy's premier torpedo bomber. When it debuted, it was state-of-the-art, but by the dawn of World War II, it had become perilously outclassed. At the Battle of Midway, it suffered catastrophic losses, and in the wake of that disaster, the Devastator was all but erased from service. But that failure paved the way for a resounding success soon after. The sacrifice of the TBD crews was critical, though it is too often overlooked. For had it not been for them, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers would never have had their chance to write a glorious chapter in history against the frenzy of the Japanese Zeros. In the early 1930s, the United States Navy initiated an ambitious program to modernize its fleet of carrier-based aircraft. At that time, torpedo bombing was accomplished by outdated biplanes that lacked the performance capabilities required for modern naval warfare. The primary issue was that torpedoes ran poorly unless dropped at very low speeds and altitudes, making aircraft vulnerable during attack runs. Furthermore, there was significant concern within the fleet about the effectiveness of torpedo bombers altogether, with some advocating for their elimination. To address these challenges, the U.S. Navy initiated a design competition in 1934 for new carrier-based bombers, specifically for its expanding carrier fleet, including USS Ranger, which was scheduled for commissioning later that year. Among the entrants were Vought with its XSB-2U Vindicator, Northrop with its BT-1, Brewster with its SBA, and Douglas with its XTBD-1. The competition would ultimately change the face of naval aviation. The Douglas submission represented something truly revolutionary. The Douglas XTBD-1 was officially ordered on June 30, 1934, after being selected as one of the winners of the Navy competition. Douglas Aircraft Company delivered this revolutionary prototype in less than 11 months after receiving the contract. On April 15, 1935, the prototype took to the skies for its first flight, marking a new era in naval aviation history. The aircraft introduced several groundbreaking innovations that set it apart from anything flying at the time. The first American carrier-based monoplane to be widely used and to enter production. First all-metal naval aircraft. First with a completely enclosed cockpit. First with power-actuated hydraulic folding wings. The prototype was powered by an 800 HP Pratt & Whitney XR1830-60R1831 engine. Initial testing proceeded remarkably smoothly, and within just 9 days of its maiden flight, Douglas was able to transfer the aircraft to the U.S. Navy for service trials, a testament to its sound design and engineering. Following successful carrier trials on the USS Lexington, the Navy placed an initial order for 114 production aircraft on February 3, 1936, with an additional 15 later added to the contract. The production model, designated TBD-1 Devastator, featured several improvements over the prototype, including an upgraded Pratt & Whitney R1830-64 twin Wasp engine that produced 900 horsepower. The first production TBD-1 was delivered to the Navy on June 25, 1937, with Torpedo Squadron 3 VT3 aboard USS Saratoga, becoming the first unit to receive the aircraft on October 5, 1937. As more Devastators entered service, they replaced older biplane torpedo bombers like the Martin BM-1s and Great Lakes T-2s. Beginning in 1937, the aircraft reached 7 carriers: Saratoga Enterprise, Lexington Wasp, Hornet Yorktown, and Ranger. The Douglas TBD-1 Devastator featured a distinctive greenhouse canopy that housed a crew of 3 specialists. The pilot occupied the forward position with excellent visibility over the nose. The bombardier, also serving as torpedo officer and navigator, sat in the middle seat. During bombing runs, he would slide into a prone position beneath the pilot to operate the top-secret Norden bomb sight through a window in the bottom of the fuselage, giving the aircraft unprecedented bombing accuracy for its era. The radio man gunner manned the rear position, protecting the aircraft's vulnerable 6. A semi-retractable landing gear was also incorporated with wheels protruding 10 inches below the wings to limit damage during potential wheels-up landings. For armament, the TBD carried either a 30 or 50 caliber machine gun firing forward, plus 1 or 2 30 caliber machine guns in the rear position. At the time of its introduction, the TBD was arguably the most advanced and capable carrier-borne torpedo bomber in the world. After Pearl Harbor, the Douglas Devastator promptly entered combat operations. Throughout February and March 1942, TBDs from USS Enterprise and Yorktown conducted strikes against Japanese targets in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, followed by attacks on Wake and Marcus Islands. Thereafter, Devastators from Yorktown and Lexington targeted Japanese shipping off New Guinea on March 10th. In these early engagements, the TBD generally acquitted itself adequately. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 represented both the high point and warning sign of the Devastator's combat career. On May 7th, aircraft from USS Yorktown and USS Lexington coordinated a devastating assault on the Japanese light carrier Shoho. The TBD Devastators approached at low altitude precisely as they were designed to operate and scored at least 5 direct torpedo hits, contributing significantly to its rapid sinking. This success marked the first Japanese carrier sunk in the war and prompted the famous radio message from Lieutenant Commander Robert Ellington Dixon, "Scratch one flat top." This victory established that the Devastator, when employed correctly, could be effective. In contrast to this achievement, the following day proved disappointing when Devastators failed to score hits against the fleet carrier Shokaku despite multiple attack attempts. Notably, the Coral Sea operations differed significantly from what would occur at Midway. At Coral Sea, the attacks were better coordinated with dive bombers, often attacking first drawing enemy fighters and weakening anti-aircraft fire, which made the slow approaches of the TBDs less hazardous. As a result of using this approach, the TBDs were never seriously challenged at Coral Sea. The experience clearly indicated that torpedo bombers, especially ones as slow as the Devastator, required fighter escorts and coordinated attacks to have any realistic chance of survival. Unfortunately for the Devastator crews, these crucial lessons would be relearned at Midway at a tremendous cost. As the American planes clawed their way into the sky on the morning of June 4th. Their target, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was facing a crisis of his own, one that would turn his powerful carriers into floating powder kegs. His day had started according to plan. At 4:30 a.m., he had launched his first strike wave of 108 aircraft to neutralize the American base on Midway Atoll. The attack was successful, but the Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, radioed back a fateful message: the damage was not sufficient and a second attack is needed. This message placed Nagumo in a classic military dilemma. His reserve aircraft on the Akagi and Kaga were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs meant for sinking enemy ships. His planes on Soryu and Hiryu were being held in reserve, ready to be armed based on new intelligence. Acting on Tomonaga's report and believing no American carriers were in the vicinity, Nagumo made a logical, but ultimately catastrophic decision. At 7:15 a.m., he ordered his armorers to rearm the planes on Akagi and Kaga with high-explosive general-purpose bombs for another land attack. This process was a logistical nightmare. The heavy torpedoes and bombs had to be lowered from the flight deck to the hangar decks on elevators unmounted from the planes and wheeled away to the magazines. Then the land attack bombs had to be brought up and mounted. It was a slow, labor-intensive process that created immense clutter. Ordnance carts, fuel lines, and armed bombs and torpedoes were now strewn across the hangar decks. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A delayed report from a scout float plane from the cruiser tone crackled over the radio. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo was stunned. The Americans were here. His land strike was now irrelevant. The priority was to find and destroy the American carriers. Panic began to ripple through the Japanese command. A flurry of confusing signals followed. At 7:45 a.m., Nagumo issued a frantic counter-order. Halt the rearming. Prepare to carry out attacks on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those aircraft that have not yet been changed to bombs. The chaos in the hangars intensified. Armorers who had just removed torpedoes were now ordered to put them back on. Planes that had just been armed with bombs now needed to be rearmed. The ordnance carts, instead of being safely stowed, were now being wheeled back and forth amidst fully fueled aircraft. The decks of Nagumo's carriers, normally models of brutal efficiency, had become a scene of organized confusion, littered with explosives and flammable materials. They were in that moment the most vulnerable warships on the planet. Nagumo made another critical decision. He decided to wait for his first strike wave to return from Midway before launching his attack on the American fleet. He needed to clear his decks to recover his returning planes, refuel and rearm them, and then launch a massive coordinated strike. It was a sound tactical decision by the book, but it would cost him precious, irreplaceable minutes. As his carriers turned into the wind to recover their aircraft, their decks crowded with planes' fuel hoses and bombs. The first American attackers appeared as specks on the horizon. They were the slow, obsolete TBD Devastators. The American attack was to be charitable a mess. At dawn, 3 American carriers deployed a total of 41 TBD Devastators, essentially the Navy's entire operational inventory of the aircraft. The first planes took off shortly after 7:00 a.m. from USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, with USS Yorktown launching its strike group at 8:00 a.m. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance ordered an immediate attack once the Japanese carriers were spotted prioritizing speed over waiting to assemble a coordinated strike. The air groups from the 3 carriers had failed to coordinate. They arrived over the Japanese fleet in piecemeal fashion without proper fighter escort, stripping away any advantage of a concentrated strike. This uncoordinated assault should have been easily repulsed. But it was the sheer suicidal bravery of the first squadrons to arrive the torpedo bombers that would unwittingly set the stage for victory. Naval Lieutenant Commander John Charles Waldron received his fateful assignment in the summer of 1941, when he was selected to lead a newly formed aerial unit that would soon write its name in history, Torpedo Squadron 8. VT8. VT8 was officially commissioned on September 2, 1941, as part of the air group for the Navy's newest aircraft carrier, USS Hornet CV-8. Waldron recognized the monumental task ahead, telling his executive officer, Lieutenant Harold Swede Larson, "We're getting fresh green kids. We've got to make fighting men out of them, and we may not have much time." Waldron faced the challenge of transforming inexperienced pilots into a cohesive fighting unit while confronting the limitations of their aircraft. VT-8 was slated to receive the newer Grumman TBF Avenger. Yet timing became critical. In March 1942, 21 new Avengers finally arrived, precisely as Hornet prepared to depart for the Pacific. Waldron made a strategic decision. He divided his squadron, taking his most experienced pilots with the TBD Devastators aboard Hornet, while Lieutenant Larson remained behind with a detachment of men to train on the new aircraft. Their first taste of wartime operations came during the historic Doolittle Raid in April 1942, though Waldron's torpedo planes saw no combat action during this mission. Leading the charge was Torpedo Squadron 8, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Waldron. He was a fierce, determined leader, an Oklahoman of Sioux descent, who possessed an almost mystical devotion to his men and his mission. Before takeoff, he had handed his men a mimeographed message, words that would become immortal. "My greatest hope is that we encounter a favorable tactical situation. But if we don't, and the worst comes to the worst, I want each of us to do his utmost to destroy our enemies. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. Good luck, happy landings, and give 'em hell." Launched from the Hornet, VT-8 became separated from its fighter escort. The Hornet's main bomber group flew off on an incorrect heading, chasing a ghost signal. Waldron, trusting his instincts and navigational skills, broke formation and led his 15 Devastators on the correct bearing. convinced he knew where the Japanese were. He was right. At approximately 9:18 a.m., they spotted them, the 4 carriers of the WWII. But they were utterly alone. There were no American fighters to protect them, no dive bombers to distract the enemy. There were only 15 slow-moving planes against the entire Japanese combat air patrol of dozens of Zero fighters. What happened next is hard to describe. Violent, brutal, painful. The Zeros fell upon them like wolves on a flock of sheep. The sky erupted in a maelstrom of tracer fire and explosions. The Devastators, with their pathetic rear-facing guns, tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. The 20mm cannons of the Zeros tore through the TBD's thin aluminum skin, shredding control surfaces, igniting fuel tanks, and killing crewmen in their seats. One by one, they were blown from the sky. Waldron's plane was hit first, bursting into flames, and cartwheeled into the sea. His men followed him in. They never wavered. Despite the carnage, the surviving pilots held their course, boring in through the storm of steel, desperately trying to get into position to launch their torpedoes. The Japanese ships, maneuvering wildly, threw up a dense wall of anti-aircraft fire, adding to the hellish chaos. The sacrifice was total. In a matter of minutes, all 15 aircraft of Torpedo Squadron 8 were shot down. Not a single one managed to score a hit. Of the 30 men who flew into battle, only one survived. Ensign George Henry Gay, with a wounded left arm and burned leg, managed to release his torpedo before his plane was shot to pieces. He crashed into the ocean and hid under his seat cushion, becoming the sole American witness to the momentous events that were about to unfold. From his water-level view, he watched the annihilation of his squadron, a tragedy of epic proportions, and floated for over 30 hours before being rescued. Just minutes after the slaughter of VT8 Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene Elbert Lindsay, arrived on the scene. They too lacked adequate fighter cover. They saw the oil slicks and burning wreckage of VT8, a grim portent of their fate. They faced the same impossible odds. The Zeros, having finished with VT8, were rearmed, refueled, and hungry for more kills. Lindsay led his 14 Devastators down to the wave tops, charging straight at the carrier Kaga. Once again, the sky filled with Zeros. The Japanese pilots, masters of their craft, executed textbook firing passes. Lindsay's plane was one of the first to be hit, crashing into the sea. His squadron was methodically dismembered. Planes exploded in midair, spiraled into the ocean, trailing black smoke, or were forced to ditch. A handful of pilots with breathtaking courage managed to get within launch range and release their torpedoes. But the Japanese carriers, skillfully handled, evaded every single one. When the smoke cleared, 10 of the 14 planes from VT6 were gone. Not a single torpedo had found its mark. The sacrifice continued seemingly for nothing. The last of the torpedo squadrons to attack was VT3 from the wounded, but still fighting USS Yorktown. Led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Edward Massey, their attack was slightly different. They had a small fighter escort of 6 F-4F Wildcats from VF3, led by the legendary Lieutenant Commander John Smith, Jimmy Thack. Thack knew his Wildcat was no match for the Zero in a one-on-one dogfight. So he had devised a radical new tactic, the Thack Weave. It was a defensive maneuver where 2 or more American fighters would fly in formation, weaving back and forth. When a Zero got on one Wildcat's tail, its wingman would turn towards it, presenting the Zero with a head-on shot. The Zero pilot would then be forced to either break off the attack or become a target himself. As VT3 began its run, Thack and his men put the weave into practice for the first time in combat. It worked. The Wildcat pilots, though heavily outnumbered, managed to shoot down several Zeros and disrupt the Japanese cap, drawing some of the attention away from the lumbering Devastators below. But it wasn't enough. The majority of the Zeros still broke through and savaged VT3. Massey's plane was hit by a shell and exploded. Pilot after pilot was shot down. Again, a few brave souls got close enough to launch, but again, all their torpedoes missed or failed to run true. Of the 12 Devastators of VT3 that began the attack, only 2 survived to make it back to the Yorktown. By 10:15 a.m., the torpedo attack was over. It was by any conventional measure an unmitigated disaster. 41 TBD Devastators had been launched. 35 had been shot down or forced to ditch. The human cost was equally devastating. 37 Devastators were shot down with 32 pilots and 35 enlisted aircrewmen lost. Only 4 TBDs made it back to Enterprise, none to Hornet, and just 2 to Yorktown. Scores of America's finest naval aviators were dead, and not a single torpedo had struck a Japanese ship. It appeared to be one of the most futile sacrifices in the history of warfare. But it was not. The sacrifice of the Devastator crews, so catastrophic and seemingly pointless, had an unseen and decisive consequence. Their relentless, suicidal, low-level attacks had produced a tactical effect they could never have intended. They had pulled the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to the deck. The Zeros were all at low altitude chasing the last of the torpedo bombers or strafing survivors in the water. Unlike previous claims, it wasn't primarily anti-aircraft fire that destroyed the TBDs. The Zeros shot down virtually all of them. Their pilots were low on fuel and ammunition after the ferocious engagements. The skies directly above the Japanese fleet, which should have been swarming with fighters, were now almost empty. Furthermore, the Japanese carriers themselves were in a state of maximum vulnerability. They were still recovering aircraft. Their decks were cluttered. Their command was distracted. They were maneuvering wildly to dodge the torpedoes, unable to launch their aircraft. The heroic doomed charges of VT8, VT6, and VT3 had not only drawn the Zeros out of position, but they had fixed the Japanese carriers in place and sowed chaos on their decks. They had, in effect, held the anvil steady for the hammer that was about to fall. And at that exact moment, at approximately 10:20 a.m., the hammer fell. High above, arriving from a different direction, were the SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, had almost missed the Japanese fleet, but had made a brilliant command decision to follow a lone Japanese destroyer, which led him directly to his prize. As the Dauntlesses began their iconic near-vertical dives, their pilots looked down on a scene of unbelievable perfection. Below them were the Japanese carriers, their decks painted with a giant red circle of the rising sun, their flight decks packed with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. And there were no Zeros to stop them. The attack was swift and devastatingly effective. The SBDs from the Enterprise screamed down on the Kaga. 4 1,000-pound bombs smashed into its deck, igniting the fuel and ordnance in the hangar below. The carrier erupted in a series of cataclysmic explosions. McCluskey and his wingmen peeled off to hit the flagship Akagi. A single bomb struck the midship elevator, plunged into the hangar deck, and detonated among the fully armed and fueled planes waiting to take off. The pride of the Japanese fleet was instantly transformed into a raging inferno. Simultaneously, the Dauntlesses from the Yorktown dove on the Soryu. 3 direct hits turned the carrier into a blazing wreck within minutes. In the space of 5 minutes, the time it took the SBDs to complete their dives, 3 of Japan's 4 frontline carriers were mortally wounded, burning from stem to stern. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. This victory, this miracle at Midway, was bought and paid for by the blood of the torpedo bomber crews. Their sacrifice had created the 5-minute window that changed the world. George Gay, watching from the water, saw the Japanese carriers burn and knew his friends had not died in vain. Midway was the Devastator's last major battle. The aircraft that had proven so vulnerable was immediately withdrawn from frontline service, replaced by the far more capable Grumman TBF Avenger, an aircraft with more speed, better armor, and a reliable internal torpedo bay. The Devastator's name, once meant to inspire fear in the enemy, became a tragic epitaph for its fatal flaws. The remaining 39 Devastators were relegated to training duties or the Atlantic Theater until 1944, when the last TBD disappeared from Navy inventory. But to dismiss the TBD as simply a bad plane is to miss the point entirely. The Devastator was a product of its time, a transitional design caught in the whirlwind of technological advancement. The harsh limitations of the TBD Devastator in combat conditions at Midway were revealed. The Devastator squadrons approached Japanese carriers without fighter escort, as American F-4F Wildcats lacked sufficient range to provide coverage. Consequently, the slow-moving TBDs became easy targets for the more agile Japanese Zero fighters. The torpedo bombers were forced to fly straight and level at low altitude for extended periods, making them exceptionally vulnerable. The Mark 13 torpedo required precise delivery parameters that severely handicapped the Douglas TBD Devastator. Unlike later weapons, these torpedoes needed to be dropped from altitudes below 100 feet and at speeds under 115 knots. Furthermore, the torpedoes themselves were notoriously unreliable, often failing to detonate even when properly delivered. The combination of restrictive launch parameters and questionable reliability created a deadly equation for Devastator crews. With a top speed of only 206 miles per hour, the Douglas Devastator bomber was simply too slow for 1942 combat conditions. Moreover, its defensive armament of a single .30 caliber machine gun proved wholly inadequate against modern fighters. The aircraft's structural limitations prevented significant upgrades, effectively sealing its fate as obsolete. However, its failure was a failure of technology, not of the men who flew it. Those men took an obsolete tool and through sheer raw courage turned it into the instrument of victory. They were asked to fly into a battle they could not win, and they went anyway. The Navy immediately conducted a thorough analysis of what went wrong. The performance of the TBD squadrons revealed critical flaws in American carrier doctrine. Primarily, the Navy's idealized vision of coordinated attacks with torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters striking simultaneously failed spectacularly in practice. The experience demonstrated that torpedo bombers required fighter escort to survive a lesson Lieutenant Commander Massey of Torpedo 3 had predicted before the battle. The Grumman TBF Avenger had already begun replacing the Devastator before Midway. Indeed, 6 TBF-1s, a detachment from VT8 that had remained in the States to train on the new planes, participated in the battle from Midway Island. Critically, their early combat record mirrored the Devastator's struggles, as 5 of the 6 were shot down without scoring a single hit. The Avenger only became the most effective submarine killer and most widely used torpedo bomber of World War II later on. With growing American air superiority, better attack coordination, and more veteran pilots, their legacy is not written in the specifications of their aircraft, but in the outcome of the battle. The sinking of the Japanese carriers at Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. It shattered the offensive power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a blow from which it would never recover. It ensured that Australia would not be isolated, that Hawaii would be safe, and that the United States would have the time it needed to bring its industrial might to bear. The story of the Devastator at Midway is a testament to the idea that victory sometimes demands an impossible price. It is a story of how the most profound success can be born from the most catastrophic failure. When the surviving carriers returned to Pearl Harbor, the ready rooms of the torpedo squadrons were hauntingly empty. The bunks were cold, the familiar faces gone forever. But in their sacrifice, they had given their nation a future. They were the anvil broken and shattered upon which the victory was forged. And for that, they are remembered not as failures, but as legends. For decades, the story of the Devastator was primarily one of sacrifice and obsolescence, with no surviving original aircraft to serve as a physical testament to its history. However, recent underwater discoveries have dramatically changed our understanding of its legacy. In March 2018, an expedition led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen located the wreck of USS Lexington approximately 2 miles below the surface in the Coral Sea. Remarkably, the team discovered the remains of 7 TBD Devastators near the sunken carrier, along with 3 SBD Dauntless dive bombers and a single F-4F Wildcat. These aircraft were found in exceptionally well-preserved condition, after resting undisturbed for over 76 years, 500 miles off Australia's eastern coast. Besides the Lexington discoveries, 2 intact Devastators were previously found in relatively shallow water in Jaluit Lagoon in the Marshall Islands. These aircraft represent historically significant finds, as they were among the first American aircraft lost in offensive operations in World War II, ditched on February 1, 1942, during a raid from USS Yorktown. Currently, no original Devastators exist above sea level. The USS Midway Museum in San Diego houses the only full-sized replica originally built for the 2019 film Midway and donated by Lionsgate. This replica represents the best above-water representation of this historic aircraft. Historians now recognize that despite their devastating losses, the Devastator attacks at Midway were an essential component of the American victory, previously viewed simply as tragic failures. The sacrifice of these torpedo bombers is now understood as the crucial act that drew down Japanese fighter cover and created the vital opening for the dive bombers to turn the tide of battle. The Douglas TBD, despite its ultimate failure, had brought U.S. naval aviation into the modern era, a technological bridge to the aircraft that would dominate the Pacific theater and a lasting symbol of the unimaginable courage of the men who flew them.